Howdy, Humanities class, Film Studies, Shasta College. It is Wednesday, February. It's supposed to be clear, nice weather for these after this cold and wet spell we've had. Hope you guys are staying high and dry and keeping your mask on in public places because this thing is far from over. Your papers are all due tonight at midnight. Remember to get them in. If it's late after midnight, you'll be marked off late. You'll automatically lose 2 points, and you'll have until Friday. And if you don't hand it in Friday, you don't hand it in because it's too late by then, and you'll lose 10 points. 10 points will take you from an A to a B overnight. They're very close to it. So get your papers in. Hopefully you watched the movie. Hopefully you got something out of it, enjoyed it, and you've broken it down and analyzed it. I don't expect perfection on these early papers. That comes later. Okay, with that said, on discussions, I'm going to make an announcement. Look at discussions later on today and tell me if you've got the textbook. I'm getting some emails. Some people say it's on back order. They don't have them. So I'm not assigning readings in either book, but some people have one book. They don't have the other. So I need to know what you have so we can start signing these readings. So just say, I have it. I don't have it. And that will let me know. That's all you need to do. Pipe in. Tell me if you got the book. I'll post that in discussions. What else? Today, we're still in the early stages of film. We're coming out of the silent era, smack dab into sound. The sound revolution, which started at about 1927 or so. The ability to record sound and have it synced up with the actors' voices required technology that took a lot of years to develop. Cameras in the old days ran at 17 frames a second. Well, they found that people's more natural movement is 24 frames a second. And but until they got to be able to plug the camera into electricity, that was hard to manage. Once that became a reality, they made these tape recorders, and the tape recorder and the camera over here would sync up together at 24 frames a second, and that gave us sync sound. That's when we started with actors from the silent era not making the transition to the sound era because of vocal issues. Now, the myth is that they had bad speaking voices. Think about speaking voices now, folks. Does Brad Pitt have a good speaking voice? Does Johnny Depp? Does Matthew McConaughey really? Do they sound okay? They're contemporary sounding. They sound, I hate to use the word, like the rest of us. Well, and so it wasn't the sound of people's voices that them, for the most part, out of making the transition from silent films to talkies, as they called them. It was the fact that a lot of our early silent stars were not born in America. They were from other countries, and their accents were so thick, or they spoke very little English. A great example of that is somebody who was a huge star in his day, Rudolph Valentino. But his accent was so thick that even in interviews, people had a hard time understanding him. But he died really early, before really talkies came into being popular. And so, but other actors weren't so lucky, and their thick accents from whatever country they're from kept them from making the transition. Other actors um, did their best to get rid of their accents and to be understood. A great example would be Greta Garbo, who is from Sweden, and she was a magnificent star of silent films and made the transition to talkies with a very heavily accented voice. But she had to really learn English, and a lot of it she was speaking was phonetically spoken, and her career went up until just barely touched the 1940s as she dropped out of sight. She was the famous, uh, huge star, Greta Garbo, beloved by many. And once she dropped out of Hollywood and everything, she dropped out, folks. She dropped out, never did an interview, never did anything until she died. And that's a great story. It's a great Hollywood story, because why would you think anybody would walk away from that kind of stardom, adulation, celebrity, and money? Yes, the money was big in those days. Not as big as now, but it was big. And for those days, the Depression era, if you were making $150,000 a year, that's about like making $20 million a year now or something like that. So it was serious coinage, folks. Silent actors did very well financially. Charlie Chaplin was a millionaire. Buster Keaton, not quite a millionaire. He wasn't good financially. But other ones, Douglas Fairbanks Sr. was a swashbuckling, buckling silent film actor. He was married to Mary Pickford, who was the first woman in silent films. They lived a lavish life in Hollywood. So Harold Lloyd, who was another comedian, along Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, they did very well financially, and they bought tons of property in Los Angeles. I never really did cover too much about what took the film industry to Los Angeles. Well, one simple reason. Think it's up there every day. I wasn't there today, but I'll be there tomorrow. The sun, folks. Most of the films, many early films were made on the East Coast, New York, New Jersey, especially New Jersey. And the weather's pretty grim back there most of the year. And so shooting was not so conducive to filmmaking. They discovered the sunshine out in Southern California. There are other reasons why the industry moved out here. And if you had your book, which I know you don't have, maybe some of you don't, they talk about, you read about it in there, that there were issues of ownership of camera technology and things like that was protected in the East Coast, but on the West Coast, they were a little too far out of reach for lawsuits. And a lot of that had to do with coming to the West Coast to be out of reach of lawsuits on technical issues, really boring technical issues of how the camera works. Apparatuses within the camera all have to be patented. Who owns the patent? Well, some people on the East Coast thought they owned it, and so they went out to the West Coast, and they were just out of reach. This is before. It took a long time to get to the West Coast, folks. You had to take a train. They did have some planes, but not like we have now. And so if you were 3,000 miles away, you were pretty you're pretty safe from what was happening on the East Coast. So they're trying to develop sound because they want to hear people talk. Sound was in silent movies with music and sound effects, but people wanted more, and they demanded more, so the technology wasn't there. Finally, it got there. And one of the first films that was considered a sound film, it's just a talkie, as they called them, because people were talking, was called The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, who was a huge vaudevillian star. Who, guess what, folks? He performed in blackface. That was popular in those days, and he was very, very hugely popular in vaudeville. And so he, in the movie, which has been remade several times, one time was remade with Neil Diamond, the popular singer. If you remember Neil Diamond, he's still around, from the 60s and 70s. The story is about a cantor's son, a Jewish cantor's son, who has a good singing voice. He wants to be heard, but he doesn't want to sing religious music. He wants to sing jazz and popular tunes, which doesn't set well with his father, who's a strict Orthodox Jew. And so that's in lies the conflict. And in the movie, if you ever watch it or see clips from it, it's all not, half of the movie is silent. Even when they're speaking dialogue, they did it the old-fashioned way by putting the subtitles on, because the technology wasn't there much. But what wasn't silent was his singing and his performances, and that's what shocked people. It was a sound heard around the world, and that started the boom. There was a bunch of movies that had already been made, silent movies, and they went back and they said, people want sound, put sound on it somehow. And so a lot of the early talkies were silent movies that had already been made. Then they were forced to put this technology on it. And you can see it. It's pretty primitive. It's not like what we're used to now, because that's what people in the movie theaters wanted to see. Once The Jazz Singer went out there in the world, nobody wanted to see a silent film ever again. Now, there was a few holdouts, some brilliant directors like Eric von Sternheim, who was a brilliant silent director. He quit on his first sound movie. He couldn't take the delays, the technology, the bulkiness of the cameras, because when sound came in, cameras made a lot of noise when they operated. You could hear them clicking away. Well, how are you going to record that on a tape recorder? So you have a camera. They're a lot bigger than this, but and then they had to put these blimps, they called, around the camera to dampen the sound of the camera so that the tape recorder isn't picking up that sound. Well, let me tell you, folks, some of those early blimps, and you can see it in old documentary footage, and on that documentary, I want you to watch on the story of film on Canopy or in the textbook, you'll see pictures of these blimps, and they're literally as big as a Volkswagen Beetle, if you know what that is. They're huge. And it made moving the camera and made everything a lot harder when sound came in, because the blimp had to be so huge if they wouldn't pick up the sound of the camera running. After all these years of watching films, there's many, many movies, modern movies, by the way, not just older ones. I could hear the camera running. Even when our technology was modern, you could hear it running sometimes, if you really listen to it. They're really silent now, of course, because it's all no more film cameras for the most part. It's all recorded to a hard drive, which is completely silent. Anyway, so here comes sound. Now people were clamoring to hear more sound. So the early sound movies, they didn't have the technology to move the camera much because the size of the blimp. And so the actors, for the most part, have to stand still or sit on a table. And the microphone was only as good as how close it was to the actor. And so this terminology called flower pot acting occurred. So if you watch a scene in an old movie, say 1930 or 1929, you'll have somebody sitting at a table talking to somebody else at the table, and there'll be a flower pot there. I'm not kidding, with flowers in it, and the microphone is hidden in the flower pot, and the actors are all leaning towards it. You don't notice it, but now that you know it, you'll maybe notice it. They're leaning towards the flower pot to be heard because that's where the microphone is. This went on for a lot of years until they figured out how to do what they call a boom with the microphone that's overhead on a big pole. You've seen pictures of this. Sound man is holding a big pole, or it can be on a big rolling tripod because the early microphones are very heavy. And so it would be above the actor's head and it could be moved around. And once they started moving the microphone, it freed up the whole system. But before that technology came into being, they were making movies the best they could, hiding the microphones under tables and furniture where they could hide it from the public, the camera's eye, I should say. And the actors are kind of forced to they're speaking loudly. It's not intimate, and they're speaking towards a bush or a tree because that's where the microphone is. Now, also, what sound brought in to the film industry was what they called sound studios. That's the big airplane hangar studio that we still have, and there was no more going out on the street like silent films and film because there's too much noise from traffic, people talking. You can hear people, and they can't quiet everything down. They try, but they can't. And so they took most movies into studios, these big soundproof studios. Maybe you've been to one. Maybe you've been to Universal Studios. You know what I'm talking about. They're usually huge airplane hangar type studios, and they have walls that are this thick with cushions. The whole place is soundproof. When they shut the door, you can't hear anything on the outside leaking into the building. And so that's why so many films of that era, the 30s and 40s, were filmed on sound stages. They even when they would go outside, it would be a fake environment. And they were very clever the way they did it. Like, for example, watch Casablanca, 1942 with Humphrey Bogart. It's supposed to be in the Casablanca in northern Africa during World War II. Well, it was filmed all in Universal Studios in LA. But they go outside and you see water. They're very clever how they do this. They make the environment total. They got fake palm trees, fake water. Everything's fake. It's all done, and the Hollywood freeway is 20 feet away. But because it's in a sound studio, you don't hear it. And so don't feel sorry for these actors thinking, oh, God, they had to fly clear to Casablanca in North Africa. No, folks, they had to drive into Burbank from their big houses in Beverly Hills. Now, later on, some brave filmmakers like John Huston, who I'll talk about a little later, he only liked filming out in the actual environment, and he would take his crews down to Mexico, to Africa. He filmed The African Queen there with Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn. Bogart hated it because it was really rough. The bugs and the leeches and all the torment that on that river is real because Huston wanted to experience the reality of it. He also loved to be out of Hollywood from the reaches of the nosy producers. A lot of filmmakers went on location for just that very reason. Anyway, so we're talking about early sound. So now what's happened? People expect more from their stories verbally, not visually. And so movies stopped being such a visual medium and became an audio medium. It was people talking nonstop, but the camera's not doing anything visually. It's photographing actors talking at each other, but it's not doing anything clever or showing the story through the visual lens. There were still brilliant movie directors like Alfred Hitchcock who loved telling a story visually, but it was hard because he had to keep everybody talking also. And so telling the story visually was really important to early Hollywood cinema. It's important to me because they are called movies. You know why they're called movies, folks? People are moving. The camera moves. Movies, they're moving. They're actually not, they're not called standing still. They're called movies. So if you could combine the two, the visual to tell your story. And when I say visual, I'm not talking about filming nonsensical things that have nothing to do with the scene. I'm saying what you're filming on your camera gives you a visual sense of the comedy, the tragedy, the violence, the pathos, the whole story. It's not just being told through actors talking, but it's through visuals, what the camera sees, where how it follows the actor, what is going on in the background, the weather, so many influences. Too bad. I'm going to do this next Monday. Eisenstein, we're going to talk about him. Have to. He was a Russian filmmaker, and he created a visual style in the silent era, Battleship Potemkin, which I'd love for you guys to see some. I'm going to assign that a YouTube video. At least see the previews to it. You don't have to watch the whole film. You need to see what it looks like because he is the godfather of what they call montage. Another fancy French word. Who out there knows their French? It simply means a montage. It's a series of images or shots that create a dynamic storytelling narrative. And he is the godfather at that. Without the history of montage, we wouldn't have cinema, essentially that. And a Russian by name of Sergei Eisenstein did that brilliantly. And his movie Battleship Potemkin was a legendary film that utilized that technology. And it once again exploded onto this world of cinema. Everybody in the early cinema history saw that film and immediately saw the future of what film could really be. Visually stimulating montage. In the meantime, they were hiring writers like crazy, mostly from New York, who were playwrights, because that's what a play is all spoken dialogue. And these playwrights and novelists, they got famous novelists like F. Scott Fitzgerald and William Faulkner, Dashiell Hammett. These guys could make real money writing screenplays. None of them were too happy about it because they felt constrained. When they wrote their novels that they were famous for, they had complete freedom. When you're hired by a studio to write a screenplay, you have very little freedom. And people like Faulkner really rebelled against it and really exacerbated his drinking. And he has some credits, he does. And finally, he went back home to continue writing novels. He walked away from the serious big money you could make as a screenwriter. F. Scott Fitzgerald essentially was destroyed by Hollywood. He had The Great Gatsby and many others, brilliant books in the 1920s mostly. And we're still, if you're in a literature class, we're still teaching his books, Gatsby mostly. And he failed as a screenwriter, but he went there for the big money. And he has very few credits, and they're not on really that exciting films, but he was paid a nice fat salary which was in those days maybe $1,500 a week. But folks, remember, this is during the Depression when people literally were living on $1,500 a year. And so if you can make $1,500 a week, $2,500 a week as a writer, you're living very well. And you're being paid to sit in an office all day. You're not now, mostly screenwriters write the scripts, they go out and raise the money, blah, blah, blah. But in those days, the studios controlled the writers. I'll be talking about more studio control stuff as our days advance to next week. So the thing I want you to take away, I'm going to make you watch this Eisenstein video. Make sure you pipe in on the discussion if you got the book or not. I won't assign any ratings to it. I hope you have. Some people have emailed me and said they have the How to Write About Movies book. That's really going to help you a lot. The other book, Story of Film, will fill in all the gaps that I'm leaving out because I can't cover it all in that documentary, The Story of Film. That needs to be watched. I'll have to go look at the new episodes on Canopy. Keep up on that. But I'll make this all an announcement. You'll see it. What else? The video is, I think the video is excellent. A lot of people have trouble with the narrator. They don't like his voice or something. This Mark Custis, the guy who wrote the book. And he had very little money to make that documentary. The documentary follows the book on the surface. The book adds a lot of the details that the documentary could not cover. Anyway, what else? Power of cinema. The power of cinema is incredibly strong. Here we are. We're coming out of the prohibition. Booze is legal again. There is ugly things happening in Germany in the early 1930s. Adolf Hitler is coming into power, and he's going to make everybody's life a living hell eventually, but not yet. But the drum beats, the drums, the war beat, drums are pounding. Filmmakers have to constantly respond to what's going on in the culture. There was a great pacifist movie made during this time called All Quiet on the Western Front, based on a famous novel. It's wonderful. And guess what, folks? It's German. It's sympathetic with German troops in World War I because there was no World War II yet. It's a beautiful film, which has been remade several times. So that's what's happening in Europe. Bad things are happening in Asia. China and Japan do not get along. There's going to be some ugly, ugly things happening there as we get towards the 1940s. This is before World War II, folks, but it's the beginning of all that. But we're not there yet. We've got 10 years or thereabouts, what they call the Great Depression. The 1929 stock market crashed. And for the next 8 or 9 years, the country was thrown into a depression like we've never seen before. No jobs, millions of people out of work. Nobody had their rent. Does it sound familiar? Nobody had their rent. There's no stimulus packages in those days, folks. They didn't know what to do, but Hollywood knew how to get your money. I mentioned last week they started making films, screwball comedies that made fun of rich people. A great example would be My Man Godfrey. That's a great example of a perfect screwball comedy, and which mostly made fun of wealthy people who had the ability to keep their money during the Depression at the expense of others who had to live in tents on the street like they're doing now in most cities in America. We had the musical movies, which is with Fred Astaire, which was like fantasy, how we would love to have it happen, fairy tale. What's going to happen, folks? We could go to the movie. We had no job. We have 2 kids to support. I've got just enough money to go to a movie. Interesting. You're going to spend your money on a movie instead of bread. That's how important cinema is, powerful it is. You go into the movie theater, and for those 2 hours you're in there, there's some relief from your life. And that's what it was all about, providing a harbor, a place to take a breath, to get out of the onslaught of the tragedy of the world the US was living through and the Depression. You go see a Fred Astaire musical and it just made you feel great. You went out to the street, maybe doing a little dance when you came out of the movie theater. You go see a screwball comedy where the rich finally get their comeuppance, and you felt pretty good about that because you felt that they needed to have their comeuppance. You go watch a Dracula movie, knowing that there's no such thing as Draculas or werewolves or the mummy. It's okay to have that outlet of disconnect from the real life that was outside the movie theater door. But the movies did relate to real life, and they made it a little bit easier. That is the power of cinema. Talk about it more next week. Look at my announcements. Get your papers in. I'll start getting them tomorrow when I get receive most of them. And remember, everything's cinema.